Good afternoon, my friends. This is Paul, and today I'm going to be reviewing to you Neo: The World Ends With You for the Nintendo Switch. I really loved playing the original World Ends With You. I didn't play it right when it came out in 2008 because I was a bit turned off by how different it seemed. But then my buddy Mike decided to let me borrow his copy and was just like, "Hey Paul, give it a try, you'll probably love it." And I did. But then we had to wait all the way until 2018 for a version of it to come to the Switch so that I could actually capture footage for my review. That version was called The World Ends With You Final Remix, and even though it didn't change a whole lot besides the controls and remixing a lot of the music, it did introduce a new epilogue that teased that there was inevitably going to be a sequel coming. 3 years later, on the same day the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles came out too, we finally have the official World Ends With You 2. And even though it's confusingly named, it lives up to that hypothetical title that I just mentioned here. So, for starters, you might be wondering what the heck is going on here, and you probably are going to be doing that throughout the whole game, as the original World Ends With You had a very outside-the-box narrative that didn't so much focus on saving the princess or collecting a bunch of MacGuffins, but building trust between the characters. This game is more or less on a similar vein. You play as a new protagonist, Rindo. He and his buddy Fret are still trapped in a Reapers game, but there's a couple of different rules this time around. I don't want to say all of them because that'll confuse you guys, but one of the biggest new changes to this game is that in the original version, Neku would work together with his partner. Now you can have up to 6 people in your party. Don't worry, you only start out with 2. Then, eventually, a familiar face from the first game, Sho Minamoto, shows up pretty much right away, so then you have 3, and you just keep quickly ramping up your party until you have a whole team instead of just a duo, like in the first game. If you're wondering, how the heck am I supposed to control up to 6 people at once? Each button corresponds to a different party member, and you can customize which party member does what ability by giving them different pins. On paper, this sounds like a disaster, and this was the kind of thing that people didn't really like about Balan Wonderworld. But in The World Ends With You, it works because these abilities are confined to battling the noise, which is this game's version of the enemies. Not only that, but each attack has a cooldown timer, so that you can't just abuse them over and over again. It's also really good to get into the rhythm of trying to make sure that you're not just having one party member do all the work. And in fact, you even get bonuses for taking turns. Sometimes after you finish a strong attack, text will appear saying to drop the beat, which basically means attack with someone else already. And if you do that, your groove meter fills up. When it fills up to 100%, you can unleash a special attack to damage the enemies even further. Eventually, you can get even higher than 100%, but let's start slowly here, shall we? The point is, the battles are in real time, and unlike the original World Ends With You, the power of the Switch allows them to be in full 3D. This is the only part of the game where the right stick actually does something, as you use that to switch between the different enemies, and then you use the different button combinations to attack the enemies with your corresponding attacks. Now, each pin does give you a different maneuver, but the buttons generally do the same thing no matter what pin you have. If you have an X or a Y pin, you're always going to be rapid tapping. If you have a trigger button pin, then you're always going to be holding down the button. Eventually, once you get more people in your party, you're really going to have to stretch your fingers out to make sure that you're pressing the buttons both at the same time and separately. And thankfully, the game does a good job of making sure that at first your fingers have more than enough room, and then eventually you keep stretching them out further, which might be a shame for some disabled people, as I'm pretty sure they're not going to be able to stand a chance in this game. Thankfully, there are multiple difficulty levels, and if you want, you can play the whole game on easy. However, it's recommended that you keep switching up your difficulty, because the higher the difficulty, the more rewards you'll get after battle. So, while theoretically you could get through most of the game on easy, you might be glad to know that you'll get more powerful pins and more yen to spend if you decide to go the extra mile and get harder. There's other things you can do besides battling to increase your stats, because this is a pseudo RPG of sorts. You can go clothing shopping and shop for different brands. In the original game, you had to have enough style to equip the clothing, but I never found that to be a problem in this game. Even though it still says you don't have enough style, you can still put the clothing on anyway. So your guess is as good as mine as to why that text is still there. You can also go shopping for food, but as you eat the food, your characters will get full, and then you'll have to battle some more noise in order to make your characters' stomachs empty again. In the original game, you'd have to wait in real time for your characters to be able to eat again, but this time it's more so of just battling. So in other words, the game gives you multiple ways of grinding. Before I knew this, I thought that the system was really frustrating, as I was like, okay, I'm in a tough boss battle, and even when I have the difficulty on easy, it still feels like the game's just not letting me proceed. But for your information, I hope that you'll just go to a food store whenever you have the chance and don't try to avoid too much noise, and you should be fine. Generally speaking, the game doesn't force its concepts on you as much as the original game, as in the first game, you would often have these Reapers with red hoods that would give you mini missions, where they'd say, if you want to get past this wall, then you'll need to master these set of pins, or you'll have to get this trend to work. Generally speaking, there's a lot less of those, and more so of just, hey, win 2 battles in a row in this area, or give me this pin that drops from this noise. So it allows you a lot more freedom and customizability in what you're able to do. You can more or less stay with the same pins the entire game and not have to worry about switching. Now, there are some bosses that'll require you to have spatial awareness, like some bosses might hurt you if you get too close. You might want to attack a more long-ranged pin, but overall, the game doesn't force you to try to have to experiment nearly as much as the previous game did, which I am very much appreciating. The only thing I can say that's a huge negative from the original game is the camera control, or more precisely the lack thereof. Now, admittedly, the original game didn't have camera control either, but that's because it was in a 2D plane. This time, since you're exploring Shibuya in 3D, sometimes you might want to get different angles to know where you need to go, or sometimes if you're trying to find clues as part of your missions, you might want to look at the buildings in a certain angle. And while the dynamic camera works okay for most of the game, in the beginning stages there were several puzzles where I would have to try to figure out where something was at a certain angle, and the camera just would not cooperate at all. I mean, the Switch has a right stick, why not use it? It's used in the battle to switch between enemies, so couldn't they have figured out how to incorporate even minimal camera control? Maybe not a full 360-degree radius, but at least give me something to work with, guys. Now, the big appeal of The World Ends With You is ultimately going to be how does it tell its story? And this is absolutely phenomenal. Not only does it work as a good follow-up to the original game, but it also does a good job of standing on its own relatively. I say that with a grain of salt because it is meant to be a sequel to The World Ends With You. It's not meant to be a remake. It's not meant to be an alternate universe. It is legitimately a follow-up taking place 3 years after the events of the original, with a nice mixture of old and new characters. One thing that's really cool about the characters is that there's a lot of scenes, not all unfortunately, but a lot of scenes that are fully voiced. And all of the original characters, with the exception of one late game character, are voiced by their original actors. So for example, Minamoto appears pretty early on in the game and he joins your party and he got his original actor, and just about everyone else has returned. A lot of them sound like they are much older. I mean, it took from 2008 to 2021 for this game to exist, so that's somewhat understandable, but some of them sound barely even recognizable had you not known who they are. The point is, the voice acting here on display is really good in my opinion, despite what some Reddit users might be saying. I especially love the two main characters, Fret and Rindo. Their dialogue, even when not voiced, feels like such natural English, and I think it's so great in a game that's so inspired by Japanese culture for the characters to feel like they're talking like native English speakers. Not only does that make the humor hit harder, but I really like a lot of Fret's one-liners. He feels like a surrogate to the audience, and when I'm confused, he's confused too. So it really helps newbies be able to know where they have to go, especially with the introduction of a yellow marker that indicates where your next objective is. Now, this doesn't always work. There are some missions that are just going to say, okay, use your head. Don't expect the game to figure out everything for you. Speaking of using your head, each character has different psyches, which means that they have special abilities that they can use. Now, unlike the pins, these abilities are relegated to when the story tells you that you can use them, but they nevertheless prove for making the story a whole lot interesting when you see their implications to the overall lore. Rindo can go back in time if he encounters a bad fate. Thankfully, unlike most time travel games, you can keep jumping back and forth between various times of the day, and if, say, you get something wrong the first time, you can go back and change it. There's not really an in-game penalty for this, and the game kind of forces you to go back in time at certain points, so it's not like you can use it as a gameplay mechanic like in, say, Majora's Mask. This will probably get your brain hurting a lot trying to keep up with everything, but again, Fret is usually there to be like, okay, I don't quite get it, but I'm just going to follow along with you, Rindo. So usually Rindo will do most of the thinking, and you just have to follow along. Fret has the ability to remind people of what they've forgotten, and this involves playing a game that's kind of like opening a safe, where you have to push the right and left sticks in a certain direction to get the picture to finalize. This is a bit of a learning curve, as there's not really any force feedback that tells you if you're on the right track, but generally speaking, if you've got most of the squares forming a picture, then you know at least one of the sticks is on the right track. Then, your fourth party member, Nagi, has the ability to jump into people's minds and remove the noise, which acts as an unofficial time trial mode of the game, where you'll have to beat the noise within a time limit, but some noise will also have additional effects. Like if the noise is red, it'll make it so that you take more damage. If the noise is blue, it means you'll be continuously poisoned until you take them out. And there's more from there, but that's just the start of the coolness, and the game just keeps gradually introducing more and more characters. Generally, I think the writing is one of the best parts of this game, as the new characters feel like they're just as developed and memorable as the original cast, and those that return, not only do they feel like you're returning home, but they still feel like a natural evolution of, yeah, after 3 years, this is how this character would act. And there are some really touching moments if you played the original game that you'll just be like, dude, I've been waiting for this since 2008. This is so cool. Overall, Neo the World Ends With You is a fantastic game, and it works both as a sequel and as a standalone game. I don't recommend that you get this if you haven't played the original World Ends With You, or at the very least haven't looked up a walkthrough. But if you have, and you're just like, I want more, I need more, then this is absolutely perfect for you. I think $60 would be a reasonable price, except from what I've heard, this is actually more like $40 or $50 because these guys aren't Nintendo. They're not charging highway robbery for their games. But I think it still would be worth it even if they charged Nintendo's prices, as there's a lot of side content that you can get. And even after I beat the main game, it said I was only 20% complete of everything that I could do. There's also a bonus epilogue chapter. Like in the first game, there are secret reports to find, where you can get even more story details about what was going on behind the scenes during the main events. You can also purchase songs for the in-game soundtrack player, and they even have descriptions for the songs, which makes it even cooler. You can unlock different pins. I only got about a third of the collection during my playthrough, and so overall this game is going to keep you busy even after the credits. The music is pretty spectacular with a lot of lyrical arrangements with a good mixture of old and new tracks. Most of the returning tracks are remixed spectacularly, but not so much that they're unrecognizable. It's more so of how Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition did it, where you still got the spirit of the original, but the higher quality of the Switch allowed for the tracks to sound more clean, or more specifically, like how you remembered them, despite being remixes. The voice acting is fantastic, with a lot of big-name actors coming in, and with nearly every returning character having their roles reprised by their original actors. Overall, I think Neo the World Ends With You is fantastic. Again, I wouldn't recommend that you play this as a standalone game. I highly recommend you at least look up a Let's Play of the original game, especially Final Remix, because that bonus chapter does play into the narrative a little bit, and you might be thoroughly confused if you've only played the DS version. But whatever you do, you are in for a fantastic time, as long as you can get past the lack of a camera angle and occasional frustrating grinding, but usually not as bad as that in the main Final Fantasy games. With that, thank you very much for watching. There's a lot to cover in Neo the World Ends With You, so I'm sure I inevitably missed something in this extensive look at the game. So let me know, what is it that I forgot to clarify? Do you have any comments, concerns, or critiques? Let me know in the comments, and until the next time, keep the faith, stay epic, God bless, and let's get more characters like Rendo in video games. We really need more simple-minded, easygoing people. Bye!